the Iron King, conquest, betrayal, and the unbreakable reign of Henry I. Kingdoms are not built solely with swords and blood. They are forged in the minds of those who understand the true game of power. And among those rulers, few were as ruthless as Henry I, the king who reshaped England through cunning, strategy, and an iron grip over his realm. But no matter how strong his reign, a curse seemed to haunt his bloodline. Brothers killing each other for the throne, betrayals lurking in every shadow, and a disaster at sea that would doom his legacy to chaos. Imagine a king who ruled with an iron fist, crushing rebellions, bending nobles to his will, and defying both the church and his own family. Now, imagine that same king dying from eating a bad meal, and his entire kingdom plunging into turmoil soon after. This is the story of Henry I, the monarch who sought to mold England's destiny, only to leave behind a trail of war and treachery. What went so terribly wrong? How could a man so powerful fail to secure his own legacy? Early life and family. In the heart of a kingdom constantly on the edge of chaos, Henry was born, the youngest son of William the Conqueror. The year was 1068, and England still trembled under the weight of the Norman conquest. From an early age, Henry stood apart from his brothers. While Robert dreamed of battle and William Rufus indulged in power, Henry turned to books. In a world where kings ruled by the sword, he mastered the art of ruling with a sharp mind. Educated in Latin and the liberal arts, his path seemed destined for the church, but the gods of war and intrigue had other plans. A prince with a keen intellect could be far more dangerous than one with a sharp blade. Yet Henry's life was never peaceful. He grew up witnessing the ruthless game of betrayal, where family bonds were tested by the weight of the crown. His mother, Matilda of Flanders, was a shrewd woman, descended from French royalty, and he inherited her cunning. But unlike his brothers, Henry was given no lands, no grand title. To many, he seemed like nothing more than a pawn in a game of giants. But underestimating Henry would be the first mistake his enemies would make. Struggles for power. Fate is a cruel game, and Henry learned this lesson the hard way. When his father, William the Conqueror, died in the year 1087, his vast realm was carved up like spoils of war. Robert, the eldest brother, inherited Normandy. William Rufus, the middle brother, was crowned King of England. And Henry? Nothing. No title, no lands, only a chest of gold, and the promise that he would have to carve out his own destiny. But in an age of conquest and fierce rivalries, gold without power was merely an invitation to be robbed. But Henry was no ordinary man. He understood that power did not come from brute strength alone, but from knowing how to play the right game at the right time. While his brothers waged war against each other, he studied their weaknesses, forged alliances, and waited. Time was his greatest weapon. Many nobles believed that dividing the kingdom had been a mistake, and Henry knew exactly how to exploit their discontent. England needed a strong leader, someone who was not just a warrior, but a master strategist. And when the moment came, he was ready to seize what he believed was rightfully his. Conflict with brothers. The fate of great kings is rarely forged in times of peace, and Henry knew this better than anyone. In the deadly Norman Game of Thrones, alliances were made and broken as swiftly as a sword stroke. At first, he allied with Robert against William Rufus, hoping to find his place in this blood-stained game. But as the winds of politics shifted, Henry realized his best chance at power lay with the brother who ruled England. And so, with a pragmatism that would define his reign, he switched sides. But fate had one final decisive move to make. In the year 1100, William Rufus fell dead in the midst of a mysterious hunt. An accident? Assassination? History never reached a clear verdict, but Henry did not wait for answers. While Robert was still far away, he raced to Winchester, seized the royal treasury, and secured his coronation before any opposition could take shape. In a world where hesitation cost men their crowns, Henry proved that a true ruler does not ask for permission. He takes what is his. But securing power was only the beginning. Reign as king. Henry did not merely seize the throne. He held it with an iron grip and reshaped England in his own image. His reign was not just marked by conquest, but by a fiercely efficient administration. He understood that maintaining power required more than sharp swords. It demanded absolute control over the nobility and a bureaucracy that functioned like clockwork. With this vision, he reformed the justice system, expanded taxation, and established a stronger centralized government than any king before him. But ruling England was not enough. He wanted more. In the year 1106, his conflict with Robert reached its climax at the Battle of Tinchebray. Henry's forces crushed his brother's army, and Robert was captured. The very man who once shared royal blood with him would now spend the rest of his days in captivity. Normandy was in Henry's hands, and England had never been more secure. But, as with any king who ruled with an iron fist, new challenges were always lurking in the shadows. For those who wish to delve deeper into the life of Henry I and the impact of his reign, a highly recommended book is Henry I, King of England and Duke of Normandy by Judith Green. This work explores his rise to power, his reforms, the wars he waged, and of course the chaos he left behind. It is essential reading for anyone eager to understand medieval politics and the legacy of one of England's most cunning monarchs. Government reforms. A king does not rule by the blade alone, but by the stroke of the pen. Henry understood this better than anyone. He did not simply crush his enemies on the battlefield, he defeated them in financial records and in the courts of law. He established the Exchequer, a revolutionary system for tax collection that brought economic stability to England. With it, he ensured that money flowed steadily into the royal treasury and that every coin was accounted for. This was a masterstroke. While other kings begged for gold to fund their wars, Henry simply managed his resources better. Beyond this, he reformed the justice system, strengthening royal courts and expanding the reach of the kingdom's laws. He had no tolerance for nobles who defied his authority and made it clear that no one stood above the king. With the introduction of traveling justices, he ensured that royal law was enforced across the land, regardless of one's status. To many, he was not just a king, he was the law itself. But the true test of his rule would not come from rebellious nobles or rival armies. It would come from an enemy far more dangerous, the church itself. Conflict with the church. If ruling a kingdom was already a challenge, imagine facing the only institution that could challenge royal authority without ever raising an army. The church, with its influence over the hearts and minds of the people, was a power that rivaled the throne. Henry I knew this and had no intention of allowing the clergy to dictate who held influence in his government. The struggle began with the investiture controversy, a fierce dispute over who had the right to appoint bishops, the king or the pope. Henry, ever the pragmatist, had no intention of relinquishing this power. After all, controlling the bishops meant controlling a crucial part of his own kingdom. The conflict reached its peak with the Concordat of London in the year 1107, an agreement that officially granted the Pope the right of investiture, but still allowed the king to demand fealty from his bishops. It was a classic Henry maneuver. On paper, he had lost, but in reality, he retained much of his influence. Though this conflict seemed resolved, it planted the seeds for future clashes between the crown and the papacy. But while Henry secured his grip on power, a tragedy was about to strike, one that would shake his reign like never before. The White Ship Disaster. 1120. The fate of a kingdom can be decided in an instant, and sometimes all it takes is a shipwreck. On the night of the 25th of November in the year 1120, the White Ship set sail from Normandy toward England, carrying the next generation of Anglo-Norman nobility. Among its passengers was Henry's only legitimate son and heir, William Adelin. But this was no solemn voyage. The crew was drunk, and the revelry on board stood in stark contrast to the seriousness of their mission. When the ship struck a submerged rock, the celebration turned to horror. Only one survivor lived to tell the tale. The news devastated Henry. A king who had spent his life consolidating power now found himself without a secure heir. The White Ship disaster plunged the English monarchy into an unprecedented succession crisis. The stability Henry had so carefully built was beginning to crumble, and the king would have to act swiftly to prevent his legacy from sinking beneath the waves. But how does a ruler secure his realm without an heir? Henry was about to make a decision that would shock his court and all of England. Attempt to secure succession. The absence of a legitimate male heir was a dangerous flaw on the chessboard of power. Henry I knew that a kingdom without a successor was an open invitation to chaos, and, with the death of William Adelin, all the political alliances he had carefully woven over the years were suddenly at risk. The most obvious course of action would have been to choose a new heir from among his many nephews. But Henry did something unexpected. He declared his daughter, Matilda, as his rightful successor. It was a bold decision. Never before had England been ruled by a queen in her own right, and resistance among the barons was immediate. Ruling with an iron fist was one thing. Convincing the nobility to be governed by a woman was an entirely different battle. To solidify this succession, Henry arranged a political marriage between Matilda and Geoffrey of Anjou, securing a powerful ally to strengthen her claim. Yet behind the smiles at the royal banquets, tension simmered. The lords of England had their own ambitions, and many saw Henry's death as an opportunity to seize control of the kingdom for themselves. Would Matilda be able to hold power after her father's death? Or was her reign doomed to collapse before it even began? The answer to that question would begin to unfold with the death of Henry himself. Death and legacy. No matter how powerful a reign may be, its end is always a moment of uncertainty and danger. Henry I, the king who had forged his rule through cunning and iron will, met his end in the most unexpected of ways. Not in battle, not by the hand of a traitor, but from a dish of spoiled lampreys. His death in the year 1135, far from the battlefield, sent shockwaves through the kingdom. But what followed was even worse. Despite decades of strategy and absolute control, he had failed in his final act as king. His daughter Matilda, whom he had declared his rightful heir, saw her crown snatched away by Stephen of Blois, and with that, England plunged into one of its darkest and bloodiest conflicts, the Anarchy. Henry's succession should have been his crowning achievement, but instead, it became his greatest failure. For nearly 2 decades, war and treachery consumed the very kingdom he had fought so hard to unify. But in the end, his bloodline was not erased. Matilda fought with relentless determination, and her son, Henry II, would eventually fulfill what she could not, restoring the dynasty to power. Even in death, Henry I left an undeniable legacy. He shaped the foundations of the English monarchy, refined royal administration, and imposed his will upon the nobility like few rulers before him. But in the grand scheme of history, can a king ever truly control his own destiny once he is gone? Henry I built a strong kingdom, forged in iron and blood. But his greatest challenge did not come from foreign invaders. It came from his own succession. With the tragic death of his only legitimate son in the wreck of the White Ship, he attempted something no English king had ever done before. He sought to pass the crown to a woman, his daughter Matilda. But history has shown us that radical change is always met with fierce resistance, and this time was no different. With Henry dead, the kingdom did not find peace. Instead of accepting Matilda as queen, Stephen of Blois, Henry's ambitious nephew, seized the moment to take the throne for himself. What followed was one of the most chaotic periods in England's history, the Anarchy. Now tell me, do you believe a king should be chosen by birthright or by their strength to rule? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, because in the next video you'll witness how Stephen of Blois turned England into a battlefield in his fight for power.